Every time Hershel Woody Williams wore the Medal of Honor, he tried to turn it away from himself. He said the medal belonged to the Marines who covered him, and to the men who never came home. But the medal hung around his neck for one reason. On February 23, 1945, when tanks could not open a path across Iwo Jima, a 5'6" Marine strapped nearly 70 pounds of fuel and steel to his back and went forward alone. The Marine Corps had once rejected Hershel Williams for being too short. In 1942, he stood only 5 feet 6 inches. The minimum height rule kept him out, so he went back to ordinary work in West Virginia, driving taxis, hauling freight, waiting while the war grew larger. Then the rule changed. Williams enlisted in May 1943. He learned demolitions, he learned flamethrowers. He learned that the weapon on his back was less like a rifle than a countdown. A fully loaded portable flamethrower weighed about as much as a small man. Its useful range was measured in a few dozen yards. Its fuel was measured in seconds, and the operator had to expose himself long before he could reach either one. By the time Williams landed on Iwo Jima with the 21st Marines, the island had already been shaped into a machine for killing. It was only a few miles long, but Japanese engineers had spent months cutting tunnels into volcanic rock, burying command posts, and connecting concrete pillboxes so that one position protected another. The surface looked open. That was the trap. The black sand gave almost no firm footing. Marines sank into it. Vehicles lost traction. Mines waited beneath it. Machine guns fired across it from openings so narrow that a man could see only darkness and muzzle flash. The defenders did not need to hold the beaches. They needed the Americans to cross ground they had already measured. On the morning of February 23, Williams' company was pinned by a fortified strong point. American tanks tried to open a lane. They could not. The sand slowed them. Mines threatened their tracks. Concrete absorbed punishment. Even when fire hit a pillbox, the men inside could survive, wait, and begin shooting again after the tank moved on. The infantry had nowhere to go. Then Williams volunteered. 4 riflemen were assigned to cover him. Their job was to fire at the bunker openings, force the Japanese gunners down for a second or two, and give Williams just enough time to move. Not enough time to be safe, just enough time to move. He left the line carrying a flamethrower and demolition equipment. The citation written later would say, he fought for 4 hours under intense small arms fire, repeatedly returning to his own lines for serviced flamethrowers and fresh charges. But from ground level, there was no clean 4-hour story. There was only the next patch of black sand, the next opening in the concrete, the next few yards where a machine gun could see him before he could reach it. Williams crawled low because the tanks on his back rose above his shoulders. He moved when the riflemen fired. He froze when the enemy gun found his lane. Then he moved again. The flamethrower was not designed to destroy a fortress from a distance. It was designed to force burning fuel through the place a fortress needed in order to breathe. A firing slit, a doorway, an air vent. That meant Williams had to get close enough to touch the bunker with flame. At one position, he climbed onto the pillbox itself. Smoke from the gun had to escape somewhere, and Williams found the vent. He pushed the flamethrower nozzle into it and fired downward. The gun stopped. No long exchange, no visible duel. Just a Marine on top of a concrete box, close enough that the men inside could have heard his boots scraping the roof. Then he went back. That part is easy to lose inside the word heroism. He did not make one impossible run. He crossed the killing ground, returned for another weapon, and crossed it again. Each trip taught the defenders where he was coming from. Each destroyed position exposed the next one. Each empty tank on his back meant the work was not finished. Williams kept circling toward blind sides, searching for vents and rear openings, using the bunker system's own design against it. He was not stronger than the fortifications. He understood what they required. Air, a field of fire, protection from the next position. Remove one and another became vulnerable. Remove enough and the whole pattern began to fail. At another moment, Japanese riflemen came at him with bayonets. Williams had almost no distance left. He turned the flame gun toward them and fired. The official citation preserved that moment because it showed how close the fighting had become. There was no armored wall around him, no remote weapon, no safe angle. Only the pressure tank on his back, the nozzle in his hands, and 4 Marines trying to keep enemy guns from cutting him apart. For 4 hours, Williams moved through that strong point. He burned out positions. He placed charges. He returned for replacement flamethrowers. He worked around the rear of bunkers while small arms fire followed him across the sand. And when the strong point finally went quiet, his company could move. That is the central fact. Not that one man won Iwo Jima, he did not. Not that the island's defenses collapsed in a morning, they did not. The fact is smaller, and because it is smaller, it is more human. One company was trapped, a lane had to be opened. The tanks could not do it, so a young Marine volunteered to carry a weapon almost half his size into the space between concrete and machine gun fire, and 4 riflemen went with him far enough to make that possible. 1,000 yards away, Marines were raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi. That photograph would become the image the world remembered. Williams did not become a photograph that morning. He became a gap in the enemy line. Through that gap, other Marines advanced. The war did not end for him there. On March 6, shell fragments wounded him in the leg. He received a Purple Heart. The battle for Iwo Jima continued until late March, leaving nearly 7,000 Americans dead and many thousands more wounded. Williams survived. That word, survived, would become both a gift and a burden. In October 1945, President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck at the White House. Williams was 22 years old. A few years earlier, the Marine Corps had measured his height and said no. Now the President of the United States was giving him the nation's highest award for valor. It sounds like the end of a story. For Williams, it was the beginning of another one. The medal could explain what he had done. It could not explain what he remembered. Like many combat veterans, Williams carried the war into civilian life. Certain sounds could bring it back. The faces of men who had died near him never became abstractions. The weapon that had saved Marines also left memories he struggled to carry. He later said parts of the 4-hour fight were simply gone from his mind, not forgotten in the ordinary way. Blank. The body had returned from Iwo Jima. The mind still crossed the sand. For years, Williams wrestled with nightmares and guilt. He had been honored for surviving a place where so many better known, better loved, equally brave men had not. That is why he resisted the idea that the medal was his alone. The public saw one name engraved in history. Williams remembered the men outside the frame, the riflemen who fired so he could move, the Marines whose bodies remained on the island, the families who received a telegram instead of a son. In 1962, Williams found a religious faith that helped him live with what the war had left inside him. It did not erase Iwo Jima. It changed what he did with it. He spent 33 years working with veterans through the Veterans Administration, helping men who carried memories they could not easily explain to people who had never been in combat. He served for decades as a chaplain within the Medal of Honor community, and late in life, he focused on a group he believed the country too often asked to grieve in private: Gold Star families, the mothers, fathers, spouses, children, and siblings of service members who died in uniform. In 2010, the foundation bearing his name began building Gold Star families memorial monuments across the country. The man whose life had been defined by a medal for one day of combat spent his final years building places for other names. That was not separate from Iwo Jima. It was the rest of the story. The honors continued. A veterans medical center in West Virginia took his name. The Navy named an expeditionary sea base after him. In 2020, the USS Hershel Woody Williams entered commission, a ship hundreds of feet long carrying the name of a Marine once rejected for lacking a few inches of height. But Williams never allowed the size of those honors to change the direction of the medal. Outward, toward the Marines who covered him, toward the dead, toward the families who lived with an empty place at the table. On June 29, 2022, Hershel Williams died at 98. He was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from World War II. His body later lay in honor in the United States Capitol. By then, the farm boy from Quiet Dell had outlived the war, most of his generation, and every other World War II recipient of the medal he wore. But survival was never the part of his life he wanted people to admire most. He wanted them to remember the obligation that came after survival. The Marine Corps once measured Hershel Williams and found him too short. Iwo Jima measured him by the ground he was willing to cross for other men. And for the rest of his life, whenever America tried to make the medal about one hero, he turned it back toward everyone who had made his return possible.